My name is Madison Reynolds, and at 28, I made the most impulsive decision of my life. I emptied my entire savings account, all $87,000, to purchase an abandoned gas station that had been rotting since 1985. My parents called me delusional. My brother Jason laughed in my face and said I was throwing my life away on garbage. But they had no idea what I would discover hidden behind a false wall in that old storage room. Something that would change everything. Before I reveal what I found that changed everything, let me know where you are watching from and hit that subscribe button if you have ever taken a risk nobody believed in. I grew up in Millfield, a small town where success had a very specific definition. My parents, Richard and Elaine Reynolds, had that definition printed, framed, and hanging in our dining room. Not literally, of course. But they might as well have. Dad was a bank manager for 30 years, and Mom taught mathematics at the local high school. They valued stability, practicality, and most importantly, the appearance of having it all together. From kindergarten, I was raised with constant reminders about the importance of making smart choices. Smart choices meant prestigious colleges, sensible careers, and retirement plans started before your 20th birthday. That philosophy worked perfectly for my older brother Jason, who seemed to absorb our parents' values like a sponge. He graduated top of his class, went to an Ivy League school on scholarship, and landed a job at a top accounting firm in Chicago right after college. By 26, he had the corner office, the luxury apartment, and the perfect girlfriend who just happened to be a pediatric surgeon. Family dinners at the Reynolds household were always the same. Mom would serve her famous pot roast. Dad would pour exactly one glass of wine for each adult, and then the Jason show would begin. Jason just closed a deal with a Fortune 500 client, Dad would announce, beaming. Jason and Stephanie just put a down payment on a vacation property, Mom would add. And there I would sit, pushing carrots around my plate, trying to become invisible. Because in the shadow of Jason's blinding success, my life choices seemed dimmer by comparison. It wasn't that I was unsuccessful by normal standards. I graduated with a business degree and landed several good marketing positions. On paper, I was doing fine. But the corporate world suffocated me. I spent 3 years at Wilson Marketing developing campaigns for products I didn't believe in. Then 2 more years at Hendricks & Co., where I watched the clock every day, wondering if this was really all there was to life. 6 months ago, I was laid off during a company restructuring. While most people would have been devastated, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. I collected my severance package, cleaned out my desk, and walked out of that glass tower feeling lighter than I had in years. Of course, my family saw it differently. This is what happens when you do not commit to a solid career path, my father said during the first family dinner after my layoff. Jason was promoted twice in the time you have been jumping between jobs. We just want you to find some stability, honey, my mother added, her voice gentler, but the criticism just as sharp. You are almost 30. It is time to get serious. Jason, ever helpful, slid a business card across the table. My firm is always looking for marketing specialists. The pay is not great to start, but at least it is something stable while you figure things out. His condescension made my skin crawl. Figure things out, as if I was still a teenager unsure about a college major. Not a grown woman with nearly a decade of professional experience. Thanks, but I have some interviews lined up, I lied, just to end the conversation. What I did not tell them was that the thought of another corporate job made me physically ill. For years, I had been suppressing a part of myself that craved creativity and purpose. I loved restoration projects, bringing forgotten things back to life. My apartment was filled with furniture I had salvaged and refinished. On weekends, I volunteered with a historical preservation society that worked to maintain century-old buildings in our downtown district. But these were just hobbies in my family's eyes, not serious pursuits for a grown woman with bills to pay. That night, driving home from family dinner, I cried. Not delicate, dignified tears, but ugly, mascara-smearing sobs. I was tired of being the family disappointment. Tired of pretending to want things that left me empty. tired of comparing myself to Jason and always coming up short. I pulled over to the side of the road until I could see clearly again. As I wiped my eyes, I made a promise to myself I would find my own path, even if no one else understood it. I just had no idea then that path would lead me to an abandoned gas station and the most difficult months of my life. 2 weeks after that family dinner, I was driving back from another dismal job interview. The interviewer had barely looked at my resume, too busy checking his phone every 30 seconds. When he did speak, it was to tell me how lucky I would be to join their dynamic team code for overworked and underpaid. I had smiled politely through the entire charade, knowing I would rather live on ramen noodles than accept the position. To avoid rush hour traffic, I took the scenic route home, an old county road that wound through farmland on the outskirts of town. I had driven this way 100 times before, but somehow never noticed the dilapidated building set back from the road, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs and a massive oak tree. I slowed down as I passed, something about the structure catching my attention. It was an old gas station, the kind for movies set in the 1950s. 2 rusty pumps stood like sentinels in front of a small building with large windows and a canopy that had partially collapsed. A faded sign reading Starlight Gas and Service hung precariously from one chain. On impulse, I pulled into the gravel lot, my tires crunching over broken glass and debris. Getting out of my car, I approached the building cautiously. The place was in terrible shape, windows broken, roof sagging, walls covered in graffiti. But beneath the decay, I could see the bones of something special. The building had character, curved architectural details, vintage tile work around the door frame, and an old-fashioned service bell still attached to a post where cars would have pulled up. I peered through one of the broken windows into what must have been the convenience store area. Dusty shelves, an ancient cash register, and debris scattered across a black and white checkered floor. Behind the counter, I could make out a door leading to what was probably a storage room or office. Something about this forgotten place spoke to me. I found myself wondering about its history, the people who had worked here, the travelers who had stopped for gas and snacks. According to the style and design, it probably dated back to the 1950s or 60s, a golden age of American road travel. That night, I could not stop thinking about the gas station. I searched online for information and discovered it was called Starlight Gas Station, opened in 1958 and closed in 1985 when the owner, Harold Jenkins, passed away without any heirs. The property had been tied up in bank foreclosure for years, occasionally listed for sale, but never sold due to its deteriorated condition and the cost of potential environmental cleanup. The next day, I called the number on the faded for sale sign and reached Rachel Morgan, a local real estate agent who sounded surprised to get an inquiry about the property. Starlight Gas Station? That place has been on our books for years, she said. Are you interested in the land? Most potential buyers plan to demolish the structure. Actually, I am interested in the building itself, I replied. Could I get a proper tour? Rachel agreed to meet me there that afternoon. As she unlocked the padlock on the front door, she rattled off a list of issues with the property: asbestos concerns, possible ground contamination from the underground tanks, structural damage, and zoning complications. The bank is asking $90,000, she said as we carefully stepped over broken floorboards. But between us, they would probably take less. They have been carrying this property on their books for too long. Inside, the place was even more fascinating than I had imagined. Despite the decay, you could see evidence of the mid-century craftsmanship, curved countertops, built-in shelving, even some original signage. The storage room was packed with old inventory, boxes, and equipment, all left behind when the station closed. What is the history of this place? I asked Rachel as we made our way through the cluttered space. From what I understand, it was quite popular in its day. It sat on the original route that passed through town before the interstate was built in the 70s. The owner was something of a local character, always tinkering with classic cars and collecting automotive memorabilia. After the highway diverted traffic, business slowed, but he kept it open until he died. Over the next week, I visited the property 3 more times. I took measurements, photos, and notes. I researched environmental regulations for old gas stations and looked into grants for historical preservation. I spoke with contractors about remediation costs and structural repairs. I drafted budgets and business plans. With each visit, my vision became clearer. Not just a gas station, but a retro-themed rest stop and attraction. I imagined restored vintage pumps out front, non-functioning but authentic, the convenience store transformed into a 1950s-style diner, and the garage bays converted into a small museum of road travel memorabilia. I could host classic car meetups, become a stop on nostalgic road trips, sell reproduction vintage items and locally made crafts. Rachel thought I was crazy. Madison, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this place is a money pit. The environmental cleanup alone could cost more than the property is worth. But I had done my research. There were grants available for brownfield redevelopment. The underground tanks had been properly decommissioned when the station closed, reducing contamination concerns. And the historical significance of the property might qualify it for preservation funding. Rachel, I said during our final walkthrough, what is the absolute lowest offer you think the bank would accept? She sighed, looking around at the decaying building. Given how long it has been sitting, probably $70,000. But Madison, are you sure about this? There are much safer investments. I was not sure. I was terrified. But for the first time in years, I was also excited. I had $87,000 in savings and investments, everything I had managed to put away during my years in corporate jobs I hated. It would be just enough to buy the property and start the most essential repairs. That night, I made a pros and cons list that stretched across several pages. The cons column was significantly longer. This was objectively a terrible financial decision. It was risky, impractical, and could leave me broke and unemployed. But when I closed my eyes, I could see the Starlight gas station restored to its former glory, with me standing proudly in front of it. And that vision felt more real and more right than anything I had felt in years. The next morning, I called Rachel and told her I wanted to make an offer. The bank countered my initial offer of $70,000 with $75,000. After a sleepless night, I accepted. The closing was scheduled for the following week, which gave me just enough time to liquidate my investments and mentally prepare for what I was about to do. It also gave me just enough time to tell my family. I decided to break the news at Sunday dinner, hoping that the public setting might temper their reactions. I arrived early to help my mother prepare the meal, my stomach in knots. You seem distracted, Mom commented as I mechanically chopped carrots. Is everything okay? I have some news to share at dinner, I said, trying to sound casual. Just waiting for everyone to arrive. Dad and Jason showed up together, having met for a round of golf that morning. Jason had brought his girlfriend Stephanie, and they were talking animatedly about their upcoming vacation to the Maldives. I quietly set the table, rehearsing my announcement in my head. When we were all seated and the pot roast had been served, I cleared my throat. I have some news to share. Everyone looked at me expectantly. Mom smiled encouragingly. Did you find a new job? Honey, not exactly. I took a deep breath. I am buying a property. A business property. Dad perked up at this, looking mildly impressed. Investment real estate? That is actually quite sensible. What kind of property? Jason asked, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. The moment of truth had arrived. It is an old gas station on County Road 8. The Starlight gas station. It has been abandoned since 1985, and I am going to restore it and turn it into a retro-themed attraction and rest stop. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom's fork clattered onto her plate. Dad's face reddened progressively, like a thermometer rising. Jason stared at me as if I had announced my intention to become a professional clown. Finally, Dad spoke. You are joking, right? No. I am serious. I close on the property next week. Madison, Mom said carefully, honey, have you really thought this through? An abandoned gas station must have all sorts of problems. I have done my research, Mom. Yes, There are challenges, but also opportunities. The property has historical significance. Historical significance? Dad interrupted, his voice rising. It is a rundown gas station in the middle of nowhere. Actually, it was a stop on the original cross-country route before the interstate system. The architecture is classic mid-century. How much? Jason cut in. How much are you paying for this investment? I hesitated. $75,000. $75,000? Dad exploded. For a worthless pile of junk. It is not worthless, I insisted, feeling my face grow hot. The land alone. Land probably contaminated by leaking fuel tanks. Dad countered. Do you have any idea how much environmental cleanup costs? Hundreds of thousands. The tanks were properly decommissioned, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I have done the research. Talked to contractors. Jason let out a laugh that cut me to the core. Oh, Madison. You have always made questionable decisions, but this tops everything. What do you know about running a business? About restoration? This is going to be just another one of your projects that you abandon when it gets too hard. That is unfair, I said, blinking back tears. What is unfair? Dad interjected. Is that we raised you better than this. To make responsible choices. And you are throwing away your entire savings on a fantasy. Mom reached across the table for my hand. Sweetie, we just do not want to see you get hurt. This sounds incredibly risky. Maybe that is what I need, I said, pulling my hand away. Maybe I need to take a risk instead of being miserable in a safe, practical job that makes me want to scream every morning when my alarm goes off. There is a difference between changing careers and financial suicide, Jason said. This is the latter. I thought you might actually support me, I said, looking around the table at their concerned and disapproving faces. Just once, I thought you might believe in me. We do believe in you. Mom insisted. That is why we do not want to see you make this mistake. You still have time to back out, Dad said, his tone softening slightly. Whatever deposit you have put down, I will cover it. Just walk away from this nonsense. I stood up, my dinner untouched. I am not backing out. I am doing this. I just wanted you to know because you are my family. But I do not need your permission or your approval. Madison, sit down, Dad commanded. We are not finished discussing this. Yes, we are, I replied, grabbing my purse. Thank you for dinner. Mom. Jason's voice followed me to the door. When this blows up in your face, do not come asking us for money to bail you out. I drove home in tears, my brother's words echoing in my head. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was the most foolish decision I had ever made. My entire life savings, everything I had worked for, gambled on a dilapidated building that nobody else wanted. But when I finally pulled into my apartment complex, I wiped my eyes and made a decision. I would not let their doubts become mine. I would go through with the purchase. And I would prove them all wrong. Or go broke trying. The day I signed the closing papers was surreal. I sat in a sterile conference room at Millfield Community Bank, my hand shaking slightly as I wrote my name over and over. With each signature, I watched my bank account drain by thousands. By the time I was done, I had just enough money left to cover 2 months of living expenses and the most critical initial repairs. As the bank representative handed me the keys, she smiled blandly. Congratulations on your purchase, Ms. Reynolds. Outside in the parking lot, I sat in my car and stared at the old brass keys in my palm. I had done it. I owned an abandoned gas station. My phone buzzed with a text from Jason, not too late to back out. Call Dad. I turned off my phone and drove straight to my new property. The reality of what I had taken on hit me harder than ever as I unlocked the padlock and stepped inside as the owner for the first time. The building seemed to groan in protest as the door swung open. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the dirty windows. The smell of mildew, old motor oil, and decades of neglect assaulted my senses. Hello, I called out to the empty space. I am your new owner. My voice echoed back at me as if the building itself was skeptical. The next morning, the county inspector arrived for the walkthrough I had scheduled. Dave Mercer was in his 50s with a clipboard and a perpetual frown. For 2 hours, he moved methodically through the property, making notes and occasionally shaking his head. "Well?" I asked when he finally finished. "How bad is it?" He handed me a list that unfurled like an ancient scroll. Electrical not up to code. Plumbing needs complete replacement. Asbestos in the ceiling tiles. Lead paint. Structural issues with the roof and east wall. HVAC non-existent. And that is just the building. He gestured toward the cracked concrete where the gas pumps had been. The underground area where the tanks were removed will need environmental testing before you can do anything substantial. But the tanks were properly decommissioned, I protested. In 1985, Dave replied flatly, "Standards have changed. You will need new certification before any permits are approved." He left me standing in what would have been the convenience store area, holding a list of violations that would cost far more to fix than I had available. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm me. I had made a terrible mistake. My family was right. No, I could not think that way. I needed a plan. I spent that day cleaning, just to feel like I was accomplishing something. I filled 12 large trash bags with debris and barely made a dent in the chaos. As evening approached, I realized I had forgotten to eat all day. I drove to the nearest fast food restaurant, ordered the cheapest meal on the menu, and returned to the gas station. I could not afford my apartment and the repairs, so I had given notice to my landlord. Until I could make the station habitable, I would be sleeping in my car. That first night, parked behind the building to avoid being seen from the road, I curled up in my back seat with a blanket and tried to convince myself this was an adventure, not homelessness. The next week was a blur of physical labor. I cleaned from sunrise to sunset, separating salvageable items from trash. I discovered that beneath decades of grime, the black and white floor tiles were actually in decent condition. The vintage countertop needed repair but could be saved. Some of the original shelving was solid oak and worth restoring. Small victories that kept me going. I found a plumber willing to work for a reduced rate if I helped with the labor. For 3 days, we crawled under the building, replacing corroded pipes. On the 4th day, when we turned the water on for the first time, a main line burst, flooding the entire convenience store area. We worked until midnight mopping up the mess, only for the pipe to burst again the next morning in a different location. My savings dwindled at an alarming rate. The environmental testing alone cost nearly $5,000. The electrical system needed a complete overhaul after we discovered mice had chewed through most of the wiring. Every day brought a new catastrophe, a new unexpected expense. 2 weeks in, I was running dangerously low on funds with barely any visible progress. The property looked just as dilapidated from the outside, though somewhat cleaner inside. I had no choice but to take a part-time job at the local hardware store to keep myself afloat. I worked mornings at the store, afternoons and evenings at the station, often falling asleep in my car, too exhausted to even brush my teeth. Then came the vandalism. I arrived one morning to find windows smashed, spray paint covering one wall, and my carefully sorted pile of salvageable materials scattered and broken. A group of local teens had decided the abandoned gas station was a perfect place to party. They had left beer cans, cigarette butts, and destruction in their wake. I sat on the ground amidst the wreckage and finally allowed myself to cry. I had been holding it together through sheer determination, but this felt like the universe telling me to give up. I was broke, exhausted, and making no real progress. Maybe it was time to admit defeat. As if on cue, my phone rang. It was Jason. "Hey, little sister," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "How is the gas station empire coming along?" I swallowed hard. "Fine." "Really?" "Because a client of mine drove by there yesterday and said it still looks like a disaster zone." "Renovations take time," I replied stiffly. "Look, Madison," his voice softened slightly. "I know you do not want to hear this, but there is no shame in admitting when you have made a mistake. Dad and I have talked, and we are willing to help you out. We can probably recoup some of your losses if you sell now, before you sink any more money into that money pit." The offer was tempting. So tempting that it terrified me. It would be so easy to accept their help, to crawl back to the safety of their approval. To admit they had been right all along. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully. But I am not giving up yet. Madison, be reasonable. I have to go, Jason. There is someone here about the roof. I hung up before he could respond. There was no one there about the roof. I could not afford roof repairs. But I also could not afford to let my resolve crumble. That night, I made a decision. I would give myself 1 more week. 1 week to find something, anything. That would make this investment worthwhile. If I found nothing, I would swallow my pride and accept my family's bailout. With renewed determination. I turned my attention to the one area of the station I had been avoiding, the storage room behind the convenience store. The storage room door had been jammed since I purchased the property. I had assumed it was just warped from years of neglect, another repair on my never-ending list. But after my call with Jason, I needed to at least catalog everything in the building, including whatever was locked behind that door. Armed with a crowbar, WD-40, and desperation, I attacked the door with newfound vigor. The wood splintered around the edges as I worked the crowbar into the frame. With a final heave, the door gave way with a screech of protest, nearly sending me tumbling backward. The smell that wafted out was musty, but not unpleasant. Old paper, motor oil, and something like leather. I fumbled for the light switch, but of course. The electricity was not working in this section yet. I returned to my car for a flashlight and then stepped cautiously into the darkness. The beam of light revealed a room-packed floor to ceiling with boxes, file cabinets, old merchandise, and equipment. Decades of dust covered everything in a gray film. Cobwebs stretched between shelving units like delicate Halloween decorations. Great, I muttered to myself. Another massive cleanup job. I started with the shelves nearest the door, carefully removing items and cataloging them. Most were mundane, boxes of faded road maps, outdated automotive parts, cleaning supplies hardened with age. But as I worked deeper into the room, I began to notice something strange. Unlike the haphazard mess in the main building, these items seemed to have been organized and stored with care. I opened a metal filing cabinet to find perfectly arranged folders containing maintenance records, receipts, and business documents dating back to the 1950s. Another cabinet held photographs of the gas station through the decades, including grand opening pictures from 1958 showing a pristine Starlight gas and service, with a proud owner standing beside gleaming pumps. Harold Jenkins. I read from the caption on the back of one photo. So this was the original owner. 3 hours into my exploration, I had cleared only a small section of the room. My flashlight beam caught something reflective in the far corner, behind a set of wooden shelves. Curious, I made my way over, carefully stepping around boxes and debris. The shelving unit was attached to the wall, but something about it seemed off. It did not quite meet the corner as it should have. I ran my fingers along the edge and felt a slight draft. Examining it more closely, I realized this was not a normal wall at all, but some kind of partition. My heart began to race. With renewed energy, I cleared the shelves, removing dusty cans of motor oil and boxes of spark plugs. Once empty, I could see that the entire unit was actually a cleverly disguised door. There was no handle, but when I pushed against it, it moved slightly. I wedged my crowbar into the gap and pulled. With a groaning sound, the false wall swung outward, revealing a hidden room beyond. What on earth? I whispered, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Unlike the cluttered storage room, this space was arranged like a museum. Glass display cases lined the walls. Shelves held items carefully placed and labeled. And in the center of the room stood 4 vintage gas pumps in pristine condition, gorgeous Art Deco pieces with rounded glass tops and ornate detailing. I moved forward in a daze, my flashlight illuminating treasures at every turn. A complete collection of route maps from the 1950s, preserved in plastic sleeves. Automotive signs and advertisements, their colors still vibrant. Model cars arranged by year and make. rare car parts stored in labeled boxes. But it was the document framed on the wall that made my knees weak. It was a historical designation certificate, declaring the Starlight gas station as an official historic landmark on Route 66, the famous highway that had once been America's primary east-west artery. According to the certificate, the Starlight had been a significant stop on the route, known for its unique architecture and the classic car collection its owner maintained on site. Route 66, the Mother Road, the main street of America. Thousands of nostalgic tourists still traveled portions of the historic highway each year, seeking connections to America's golden age of road travel. My gas station, my worthless junk heap of a gas station, was part of that history. With trembling hands, I began taking photos of everything in the room. The gas pumps alone, I suspected, would be worth thousands to collectors. The automotive memorabilia, the signs, the maps, all had value in the vintage market. But the historical designation was potentially the most valuable discovery of all. Historic properties could qualify for grants, tax incentives, and preservation funding. I sat down on a dusty stool, my mind racing. This changed everything. The Starlight was not just a dilapidated building. It was a time capsule, preserved and hidden away by an owner who clearly understood its value. That night, I slept in my car as usual, but with a stack of Route 66 guidebooks and historical documents beside me. I spent hours researching collectors of automotive memorabilia, restoration grants, and the booming nostalgia tourism industry. The next morning, I called Greg Peterson, a collector whose information I had found in an online forum for vintage gas station enthusiasts. "I have some items you might be interested in," I said when he answered. "Vintage gas pumps, primarily. Globetop models from the 1950s, Starlight brand, in remarkably good condition." There was a pause on the line. "Starlight pumps? In good condition? Those are extremely rare. Where did you find them?" "In a hidden room at the Starlight gas station on Old Route 66. I recently purchased the property." "The Starlight is still standing?" His voice rose with excitement. "That place is legendary among collectors. Harold Jenkins was known for having one of the finest collections of road travel memorabilia in the country. When he died, everyone assumed his collection had been sold off or lost." "Well, it wasn't," I replied, a smile spreading across my face. "It was hidden behind a false wall. And now it's mine." Greg offered to drive out the very next day to see the collection. By the time he left, he had made an offer of $20,000 just for 2 of the gas pumps, allowing me to keep the other 2 for display. He also connected me with the Route 66 Historical Society, who expressed immediate interest in helping me apply for preservation grants. That evening, as I sat on the hood of my car watching the sunset paint the old gas station in golden light, I felt something I had not experienced in months: hope. I was still facing enormous challenges and expenses, but now I had resources, connections, and a clear vision for what the Starlight could become. I picked up my phone and scrolled to my family's contact information. My thumb hovered over the call button as I imagined their reactions to my discovery. The vindication. The satisfaction of proving them wrong. But I put the phone away. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about me and the Starlight. I would tell them eventually, but first, I had a gas station to restore. The next few months passed in a blur of activity. With the money from selling 2 of the vintage gas pumps, I was able to address the most critical repairs and hire a professional to test and certify that the property had no remaining environmental issues from the old fuel tanks. This certification alone removed the biggest hurdle to my renovation plans. My next step was meeting with the State Historical Society. When I showed them the hidden collection and the original historical designation certificate, they were astonished. Within weeks, they had fast-tracked my application for a new official historic listing. "This is a significant find, Ms. Reynolds," said Dr. Eleanor Wright, the Society's president, as she carefully examined the artifacts. "The Starlight is a perfect example of mid-century roadside architecture, and its connection to Route 66 makes it especially valuable from a preservation standpoint. With the Historical Society's backing, I qualified for a matching grant program for restoration. The grant would match dollar for dollar any funds I put into historically accurate renovations. Suddenly, my limited budget had effectively doubled. I also made strategic decisions about the vintage collection. While I sold some items to fund the renovation, I kept the most significant pieces for display. Each sale felt like saying goodbye to a friend, but I reminded myself that the ultimate goal was saving the Starlight itself. Word about the Route 66 time capsule began to spread. A reporter from the Millfield Gazette came out to do a story, which was then picked up by a national travel magazine. Their feature article, Hidden Treasure on the Mother Road, brought attention from Route 66 enthusiasts across the country. My Instagram account documenting the restoration process gained thousands of followers. People seemed genuinely invested in the Starlight's rebirth, offering encouragement, advice, and even donations of period-appropriate items for the eventual museum display. The local community, initially skeptical, began to show interest as well. The mayor stopped by one afternoon, curious about the activity at the long-abandoned property. "You know, if you get this place up and running, it could bring tourism dollars to Millfield," he said, surveying the progress. "The council might be willing to expedite some of your permit processes." Even the hardware store where I worked part-time caught the enthusiasm. The owner, Ted Baker, offered me a discount on materials and eventually became an informal advisor on the project, sharing his knowledge of old buildings and connections with local tradespeople. For months into the renovation, I had a functioning roof, updated electrical system, new plumbing, and a partially restored exterior. The original neon Starlight sign had been carefully refurbished and reinstalled. At dusk, when I turned it on for the first time, the blue and yellow lights cast a warm glow that made the station look alive again. It was around this time that my family finally decided to see what I had been working on. They arrived unannounced one Saturday afternoon while I was painting the trim around the windows, a historically accurate shade of turquoise that perfectly matched the original color found under layers of more recent paint. I spotted their car pulling into the gravel lot and felt my stomach tighten. I had not spoken to any of them since that disastrous family dinner, apart from brief text exchanges letting them know I was alive. Dad got out first, surveying the property with obvious surprise. Mom followed, looking nervous. Jason emerged last, his expression unreadable behind designer sunglasses. "Madison," Mom called, waving tentatively. "The place looks different." I climbed down from my ladder, wiping my hands on my paint-spattered jeans. "What brings you all out here?" "We saw the article in the Gazette," Dad said. His tone was neutral, but I could detect a hint of something else. "Curiosity? Respect? Thought we should see what all the fuss is about." "You have been busy," Jason commented, removing his sunglasses to get a better look at the restored neon sign. "I will admit, it looks less like a tetanus risk than the last time I drove by. Would you like a tour?" I offered, feeling oddly formal with my own family. I showed them around the property, explaining my vision for each area. The convenience store would become a 1950s-style diner, serving simple food to travelers. The garage bays would house the museum displaying Harold's collection. The outdoor area would feature the restored gas pumps, non-functioning but authentic, and seating where visitors could relax. As we walked, their skepticism visibly melted. Mom gasped with delight at the black and white checkered floor I had painstakingly restored. Dad asked thoughtful questions about the grant process. Even Jason seemed impressed by the financial projections I had developed. "And you found all this behind a false wall?" Mom asked as we entered the storage room where I had made my discovery. I had converted half of it into a small office, with the remaining space used to carefully catalog and preserve items from Harold's collection. Yes, and some of the more impressive memorabilia I had kept. "This is actually quite remarkable," Dad admitted, examining a framed map of the original Route 66. "You have put a lot of work into this." "I have," I agreed. "And there is still so much more to do." As they were preparing to leave, Jason lingered behind the others. So, he said, his voice lower than usual. It looks like you might actually pull this off. That is the plan. Listen, Madison, he shifted uncomfortably. I might have been a bit harsh before. If you need any help with the business side of things, accounting, tax strategies for the historical designation, I could, offer some advice. I recognized this as the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get from my brother. I might take you up on that, I replied. Once we are closer to opening. He nodded and turned to go, then paused. For what it is worth, I am impressed. This took guts. After they left, I sat in my little office, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Their approval should not have mattered anymore, but I could not deny the validation felt good. Still, I was glad I had discovered the Starlight secrets on my own, that I had pushed through the hardest parts without their support. This victory was mine. The following weeks brought partnerships with local businesses. The craft brewery in town created a Route 66 beer to be sold exclusively at the Starlight. A local bakery developed a road trip cookie box. Artists asked about displaying road-themed works in the diner area. Social media interest continued to grow. I hired a local college student studying marketing to help manage the accounts and create content. Together, we developed a strong brand identity centered around nostalgia, adventure, and Americana. By month 6, the transformation was remarkable. The exterior gleamed with fresh paint in the original colors. The diner area featured restored vintage booths I had found at an auction, along with period-appropriate fixtures and decor. The museum was taking shape, with display cases built by a local craftsman showcasing Harold's treasures. The night before our soft opening event for local businesses and media, I stood in the center of the property, taking it all in. From derelict junk heap to vibrant historical attraction, the Starlight had come back to life. And in the process, so had I. My phone buzzed with a text from my new assistant. CNN Travel wants to feature us in their American Road Trip series next month. Call me. I smiled and looked up at the neon sign glowing against the twilight sky. Whatever happened next, I had already succeeded in the ways that mattered most. Grand opening day dawned clear and perfect, as if even the weather was celebrating the Starlight's rebirth. I arrived at 5 a.m., too nervous to sleep anyway, and found a surprise waiting for me. A line of vintage cars parked along the road, their owners setting up a spontaneous car show in honor of the occasion. Hope you do not mind, called out a man polishing the chrome on a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air. Word got around in the classic car community. We wanted to be part of history. By the time we officially opened at 10 a.m., the crowd stretched down the county road. The mayor gave a short speech, praised the economic opportunity the Starlight represented for Millfield, and handed me a plaque from the city council commemorating the historic restoration. Route 66 enthusiasts had traveled from as far as California and Chicago to attend. They wandered through the museum in reverent silence, photographed every detail, and bought out our entire stock of commemorative t-shirts by noon. The diner, managed by a local chef I had partnered with, served classic American road food, burgers, shakes, and apple pie. Every table was full, with a waiting list that grew throughout the day. "This is insane," Lizzie, my college student assistant, whispered as she rushed past with another box of souvenir postcards. "We have got people posting about us from all over the country. The hashtag Starlight Revival is trending in 3 states. Amid the chaos, I spotted my family arriving. Mom was dressed up as if for church, Dad wore a tie, and even Jason had traded his usual business casual for a proper suit. They stood awkwardly at the edge of the crowd until I made my way over to them. "This is quite a turnout," Dad said, surveying the packed parking lot. "Seems you have become something of a local celebrity." "I am just the caretaker," I replied. "The Starlight is the real star." Mom hugged me tightly. "We are so proud of you, Madison. What you have accomplished here is extraordinary. Have you seen the write-up in American Road?" Jason asked, pulling out a magazine from his briefcase. 6 pages, including the cover. I took the magazine with trembling hands. There it was, the Starlight gas station on the cover of a national publication with the headline, Mother Road Miracle. How one woman rescued a piece of American history. They sent me an advance copy, Jason explained. I have a client who works in their publishing office. Thought you might want to see it before it hits newsstands next week. Thank you, I said, genuinely touched by the gesture. As I showed them around, Dad kept pointing out details to other visitors. My daughter restored those pumps herself, he told a couple taking photos. Found them hidden away for 40 years. Jason, meanwhile, cornered me by the museum entrance. Several investors have approached me about your concept, he said quietly. They're interested in possibly franchising this idea for other historic gas stations along Route 66. If you want, I could set up a meeting. Let me get through today first, I laughed. But yes, I would be interested in talking. Late in the afternoon, as the crowd finally began to thin, a distinguished older man approached me. He wore a bow tie and had the air of someone important. Ms. Reynolds? Harold Jenkins, Jr., he extended his hand. I believe you have become quite familiar with my father's collection. I froze, my heart suddenly racing. Mr. Jenkins? I did not know Harold had any family. He smiled kindly. He and I were estranged for many years, I am sorry to say. I left Millfield as a young man and rarely returned. When he passed, I was overseas and unable to handle his affairs properly. By the time I tried to locate his belongings, the property had been tied up in legal complications. I am so sorry, I began, suddenly worried he might lay claim to the collection I had built my business around. If you want the items back. He waved away my concern. Not at all. Seeing what you have done here, preserving not just the objects, but the spirit of the place, this is exactly what my father would have wanted. I simply came to thank you and to share some stories about the Starlight in its heyday, if you are interested. For the next hour, Harold Jr. told me tales of growing up at the gas station, of his father's passion for automotive history, and of the many famous travelers who had stopped at the Starlight during its golden years. Each story was a gift. Another thread connecting me to the building I had come to love. As the sun began to set on opening day, I found a quiet moment alone in my office. The day's receipts were substantial. We had made back nearly a quarter of my initial investment in a single day. The pre-orders for upcoming events were even more promising. But the financial success, while validating, was not what brought tears to my eyes as I sat looking at the framed first dollar I had earned at the Starlight. It was the realization that I had found something I never knew I was searching for: purpose, passion, and the courage to define success on my own terms. My phone buzzed with a text from Ted at the hardware store. Congratulations, Madison. Millfield has not seen anything like this in decades. You have put us back on the map. Outside, the neon Starlight sign hummed to life as darkness fell, casting its blue glow over visitors still lingering in the parking lot. From my window, I could see my parents and Jason chatting with locals, looking more relaxed than I had seen them in years. The journey from that first day of signing the purchase papers to now had been the most challenging period of my life. There had been moments of despair, exhaustion, and doubt. Nights spent sleeping in my car wondering if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. Days of backbreaking labor with seemingly no progress. The constant fear of failure. But there had also been discoveries, both literal and metaphorical. I had uncovered not just Harold's treasures, but my own strength. I had learned that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards, and that the path others expect you to follow is not always the one that leads to fulfillment. As I prepared to join the remaining guests for the ceremonial lighting of the restored road sign, I thought about all the people who had stopped at the Starlight over its long history. Travelers on journeys of their own, pulling in for gas, food, or just a moment's rest before continuing onward. In a way, the Starlight had been a waypoint on my own journey, from a life of quiet desperation to one of purpose and joy. And now it would serve as a waypoint for others, connecting the past to the present, reminding us all of a time when the journey itself was the destination. I stepped outside into the warm evening air where a small crowd had gathered for the final event of the day. As I flipped the switch to illuminate the newly restored road sign, applause erupted. The massive starlight arrow, pointing skyward, glowed against the darkening sky, a beacon visible for miles down the old highway. "Thank you all for being part of this journey," I said to the assembled guests. "The starlight has been given a second life, and in many ways, so have I. If there is one thing I have learned through this experience, it is that sometimes what looks like a junk heap to others might be a treasure trove waiting to be discovered. You just have to be willing to take the risk and do the work to uncover it." As the crowd dispersed and the day finally came to a close, I stood alone in front of the glowing starlight. From abandoned gas station to historic landmark, from corporate drone to proud business owner, the transformation was complete. What is your greatest risk that others doubted but paid off in the end? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if you are ever traveling the old Route 66, stop by the starlight. The neon is always on, and there is always room for another traveler on the journey. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories of taking chances and finding your own path. And remember, sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the places others have given up on, including yourself.